Alrighty, so I want to start this video off with a bit of a cautionary tale, we'll call it. If you guys remember in the last video, we were having some questions of whether or not we were putting the clutch in the right direction with the FX clutch that I'm running. It's a bit confusing. I went to go press in the clutch on the inside of the car to go hold it down because I wanted to try and spin the output shaft of the transmission to make sure that the clutch and the flywheel were all disconnecting how they're supposed to and there's no interference. Well, I forgot the slave cylinder wasn't actually hooked up to the transmission. So when I went to go press in the clutch, this totally just popped out. Like, it just totally ejected. I was able to pop this plunger back in, but honestly, I don't want to run the risk of that leaking inside the transmission. So now I have to buy a new slave cylinder, which is very unfortunate. So yeah, don't make the mistake that I did. Now I know I missed an upload last week, but that's for a very important reason. We'll get to that later in the video, but for right now, we're gonna start putting in this wiring harness. In one of my previous videos, someone commented that they kind of wanted me to go in depth with this wiring harness. I'm not sure how in depth they wanted me to go, but I'm just gonna kind of go over where everything plugs in, and I'll go over all the things that I'm not gonna be using because I know that will get confusing if you see me not plugging in some of the stuff. This is already gonna be a little bit confusing for some people, I imagine, because this is an automatic wiring harness that I am putting in a manual car. So along with the stuff that I'm deleting, we're also not going to be plugging in any of the automatic transmission related stuff. But I figured we'd get started on the passenger side where the DME is going to get hooked up and all that stuff. And the first thing you're going to notice is we have two of these plugs that look eerily similar. One of these is for the transmission control module for an automatic transmission car, and the other one connects straight to the DME. This connector that has obviously a lot less wires connecting to it, that's going to be the transmission control module. That for now is just going to get tucked back in here where the DME normally sits. And then this other one obviously is going to go to the DME. We don't have the DME in right now. I'm still waiting on that to get tuned and having it sent back to me. So we're also just going to stuff that back into here for now. And then we also have this relay. When we pulled the M44 out of this car, I had no idea what this relay is, and I honestly still don't know what this relay is. I probably should look it up, but I know that goes in here with the DME. Thankfully, for the rest of the stuff on this wiring harness, I have everything marked up already, so hopefully this will go relatively smooth. We'll start out with these red wires that we see coming off the harness. These are all going to connect to the power block that sits right here. The battery doesn't sit in the engine bay in this car, or it's not going to sit in the engine bay in this car, so we'll have power coming from the battery connecting up to this post, and then we will have these three wires connected up to this junction box right here. I don't have this hooked up right now, so I'm not going to attach these right now, but these will sit over here. That'll be fairly easy to remember. Now, this is one of the first things that we got rid of. This is the plug that goes to the secondary air pump. This isn't going to be used, so this is going to get tucked away over here. And also, coming off the same wiring that goes to the secondary air pump, we have this ground wire. This ground wire will just sit on a post right over here on this battery tray. Now we'll move on over to these plugs. This big circular plug, this is going to be your diagnostic port. This just sits right over on the strut tower on this bracket back here, slides into place. And then the smaller circle connector right here, this connects up to the ignition coil rail that sits on the valve cover. Now this side of the wiring harness, all done. All right, so next we're gonna move on over to the side with the fuse box. We have the three main relays right here, which will just go ahead and sit right here on the side of the fuse box. I wish I could tell you what these relays are for, but honestly, I cannot think of it off the top of my head, so we're just gonna skip over that. Now, the next wire we're gonna look at is this little red wire that connects up to the relay and then also goes up into the main wiring harness. This is the main power wire that powers everything in the fuse box, so this is just going to go right on this little post next to where the relays sit on the fuse box. Now next up is going to be these three round circle connectors. If you notice, there are three connectors coming off the wiring harness, but there are only two connectors that I have sitting here. The third one is sitting down below over by this ABS module. That's going to be the center plug. I don't believe I'm going to have to worry about this because if I remember correctly, this middle plug only pertains to traction control and ABS, which are going to be two things that I'm generally not going to need in this drift car. So we're going to be able to not worry about this, but we'll go ahead and connect the smaller plug in the back and this bigger plug up front. Boom, that easy. Now there's going to be two more connections coming off of this side of the wiring harness. One is going to be for the MAF. We obviously don't have that in the car right now, so we're just going to be able to lay that over here. And then I believe this one is just for traction control, which also not going to have that, so this will just be sitting over on the side. Now this is where things are going to kind of get a little bit messy. This looks really daunting, but I can assure you with this video and with the wiring diagram that I'll provide down in the description, this isn't going to be too much of a hassle. This is actually pretty simple overall. We'll start back here with the starter. Coming off of the right side of the main harness up near the firewall, we're gonna have this big power plug. This is gonna go straight over onto the biggest terminal that sits back here on the starter. It'll just sit on there like that, and it'll be squeezed by this nut right there. And then you're gonna also have these two little circlet connectors that connect up to the starter. One is smaller than the other. The smaller one goes on top, and this bigger one will sit over on the bottom post under here. I'll give you guys a little bit of a closer look. Here's the power wire going onto the big post. Tiny circle connector goes up onto the top post, and then this slightly bigger circle connector goes up on the bottom on this slightly bigger post. All right, so now we can start working on this bigger mess right here. We'll start off with this long circle connector. This one is for the knock sensors that sit right here on the side of the block, so this one's easy enough. Let's throw this one on. Now there's gonna be these two connectors coming off the wiring harness. These look exactly the same, so I imagine they could be pretty easy to mix up. Now the shorter of the two is going to be the cam position sensor. And the cam position sensor comes off from the front of the head. It has this long wire that comes off and meets up with the plug. Now the other connector that was a little bit longer, that's going to be for the idle control valve. Obviously we don't have that in right now because we don't have the intake on, so that'll just sit right over here for now. Next up, we're going to do this male circle connector. This one is going to be for the head temp sensor, which just sits on the front portion of the head. You can kind of see it right over here. All right, so next we're gonna move on to this connector. This is gonna be a connector with a single brown wire with a green tracer going to it. This is going to be the oil temp sensor. This plugs in right back behind the oil filter housing, right here on the back. That just pops in. Now, this is where things are gonna start getting confusing depending on what year you have. This engine came out of a 97 328IS, and on this wiring harness, the crank position sensor plugs up directly to the crank position sensor, which sits back up underneath the starter. Now, if the information I have learned online is correct, and if I'm understanding it correctly, there was a slight change to the wiring harness for 97 and 98. Like with my buddy's 328, he has a 96, and for the crank position sensor, there's actually another sub harness that connects to other stuff that I'll address a little bit later. But for this wiring harness, since it's a 97, the crank position sensor is just this kind of half oval plug with a flat side, and it connects straight up to the crank position sensor up underneath the starter, right back there. All right, so next up is gonna be the ground connector that connects up to the alternator. This one should be pretty easy to differentiate from the ground wires that go over to the starter because they will be considerably longer. So this one's gonna connect up on the back side of the alternator on the bottom post. Now, the last thing we're gonna have to connect up while the intake manifold is off is the power wire that goes from the alternator over to the starter. So you're gonna have this one boxy end that goes over to the starter, and then you'll have this circle connector that runs from the alternator. All right, so now you can see on the back of the alternator where they're all connected, I went ahead and fed the ground wire up through this little cover. So now we can just cover this back up, and she's all good to go. Alrighty, so before things started to get too cramped in here, I went ahead and threw the power steering setup back in. Unfortunately, the old setup that I had that was for the M44 obviously wasn't gonna work in here because the power steering pump, it sits a bit more forward in the engine bay, so none of the lines really fit up right. But thankfully, my buddy Marco had the full power steering setup on his parts car. It's obviously a bunch of old, worn stuff, and it's probably gonna leak, but I figure it's better to do this, spend a little money instead of spending like $300 on a brand new OEM setup. Hopefully this will hold me over until I decide to upgrade to something like a chase-based setup in the future. Right now, I'm trying to figure out the fuel setup though. I've got the hoses connected down there at the fuel lines. Those were just regular push-on type fittings. But up here on the fuel rail, these seem to be like a quick disconnect fitting, and it's been a bit tough to try and get the hose over this. I lubed this up with oil to try and push it on, but honestly, it doesn't seem like it wants to go on too well. I'm gonna keep working at it. It seems like it's just gonna take a lot of finessing, a lot of force trying to get it on, but I'm hoping I can get the line up far enough to where it gets past this ridge far enough to where I can get a hose clamp on here just so we have no chance of these fuel lines popping off. Dude, getting these fuel lines on was something. I came to the garage the other day. I spent like a solid 2 hours trying to get these lines on, but now they're on, fully secured, and there is absolutely no chance of these coming off. If you guys remember when we were pulling out the M44, when we were actually getting the engine out of the car, there was one hose that was getting caught up. We weren't sure where it was because it went up underneath the little plate that sits underneath the car where the fuel filter and everything sits, and it didn't come out the other side. So we were just really confused, so we just ended up snipping it. Well, Turns out that goes to the fuel pressure regulator, because for some reason it didn't occur to me that the fuel pressure regulator doesn't sit on the actual fuel rail itself. It sits up underneath the car. So we're gonna get up underneath the car real quick, and I'm gonna give you guys a quick look at what we're working with. All right, so normally right here we have this plate that sits over this. As you can see, this thing is absolutely rusty. I did not think I was gonna be able to get it off, but thankfully got all the bolts off pretty easy, and it gave us access to the whole fuel lines, brake lines, and everything under here. So right here we have the fuel pressure regulator. This is the vacuum line that was on there before. Obviously this thing was super crusty, so I just went ahead and replaced it with a brand new vacuum line. But also what I learned is there's also, I believe this is the fuel pressure valve. It could be called something else, but we have this connector that comes off the wiring harness. It has a red wire with a white tracer and then a yellow wire with a blue tracer. This is just gonna plug straight in to here. So actually, I almost forgot, we're gonna disconnect both these real quick because we have to feed both of them through this little foam piece at the front of this cover. All right, so with them fed through, we can go ahead, reconnect the vacuum line. Then we can go ahead and connect fuel pressure valve connector, and we can bolt this back up. Now believe me, this is gonna get replaced at some point, but that some point is not right now. Since this wiring harness did come out of an automatic car, we have this connector that usually would go to the automatic transmission. I just rolled that up, tucked it right here, and then also I went ahead and rolled up the two connectors that normally go to the rear O2 sensors, since the tune that I'm gonna be running gets rid of those rear O2 sensors. So those are just gonna chill down here for now. Eventually, I want to clean up this entire wiring harness and actually get rid of all like the automatic transmission stuff and all the other stuff that I don't need, but for now, it's just gonna look like that. Next thing on the agenda is going to be installing the intake manifold, but as you can see, there's something missing from this intake manifold. So normally on this little hole right here, you usually have this oil separator, and this is for the PCV system. In my efforts to be able to make this engine bay as clean as possible and get rid of a lot of unnecessary stuff, we're going ahead and getting rid of the whole PCV system. So keep in mind, this is just a placeholder for now, but on the port that comes off the valve cover, I just have this filter sitting here. Normally you have a hose that comes from the valve cover over to the oil separator right here. And then the oil separator has a port that comes off the bottom and normally goes down to the oil dipstick tube, which as you can see, I put a filter on this hole to block it off, make sure just no debris gets in there. And then to fill in this hole right here, I just went over to the local auto parts store and I picked up one of these expanding plugs. Essentially what this does, this just slots right in there like that. And then as I tighten this nut, it expands the rubber right here and locks this in place. So it completely seals up this hole. So as you can see, now that this is tightened down, this thing is not gonna come out. Now believe me, I know that this filter right there looks absolutely goofy. This is the only thing that I could find that would fit for the time being. Eventually, I want to run a whole catch can setup just so I don't have oil spraying everywhere out of that filter. But for now, this is what we're gonna have to deal with. Along with deleting the PCV system, I also went ahead and did away with the whole evap system. I still have a vent coming from the fuel tank. So essentially what I did, I just took the normal evap line that comes up into the engine bay and I just went ahead and put this filter on it so that when it heats up outside and the car's sitting, there's a place for all the extra gases to expand and get out of the gas tank. I'm still debating on whether or not I want to keep that there. I don't know how I feel about a bunch of gas fumes just kind of purging into the engine bay. It feels a little bit sketchy, but I think it'll work for now. So I went ahead and threw in the idle air control valve. I don't know if this is the order you're supposed to do it, but I figure I'll put it in here now, and then once we get the intake manifold in, I'll just be able to slot it into the bottom of the intake manifold. It sits right here inside this port right there. But with this in here, we can connect up the electrical connector, which is gonna be this one. It's got 3 wires going to it. It has a white wire with a green tracer, a red wire with a white tracer, and then I believe it looks like a yellow wire with a white tracer. So that'll come right around the backside and just plug in right there. Alrighty, so I went ahead and threw on some new gaskets onto the intake manifold, and now we can go ahead and install this thing. Hey, that just fell right on, look at that. Pretty sure my head was in the way, but that is okay. Now we can go ahead and get under here and line up the idle air control valve. Oh yeah, she's looking good. Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go. Are those all seated in there? Oh my gosh. Yo, this is looking like a whole ass engine bay now. What the heck? Yo! Oh my god, it's coming together. I need to find some bolts to bolt down the fuel rail onto this. Oh, and actually, one thing that I totally forgot about. How are we gonna go about this? Yo, okay. Love that. Love to see that. Are these good nuts? Hey, that's a good nut. Oh, that's not good. Oh, I just dropped a bolt in the back of the alternator. No! Alright, so what I just put on was this brace for the intake manifold. Usually there are 2 of them, but I only have 1. Yeah, I mean, you know what they say. 1 is better than none. So I just actually realized that it's going to be a hell of a lot easier to put on the nuts for the intake manifold with the fuel rail off. So I'm just going to disconnect this real quick, and we'll just leave it floating around. What's actually funny is I realized this the other day that the engine didn't come with the nuts for the intake manifold, but thankfully BMW likes to use these nuts on pretty much everything, so I was able to go over to the old engine that was in here, the M44, and I just pulled a bunch of the right size nuts off of that. So the M44 is a bit nutless, but it's all for a worthy cause. Now with those up there, I'm gonna go ahead and connect the 2 O2 sensor wires that come from the intake, or the exhaust manifold. They're just gonna sit up here all awkwardly like. Sick! Alrighty, new gasket for the throttle body. I only had 2 of the right size bolts for the throttle body, so I had to pull 2 bolts off of the M44. Gabe says he's gonna remind me that I have 2 short of bolts in here. I need y'all to hold me accountable. Remind me to put the right size bolts in here. Okay. That's on there now. Now, as you can see, these 2 nipples are not going to have anything connected to them because these were part of the water lines that came off of the spider hose that usually sits underneath the intake manifold. But if you've seen previous videos, we did away with those. So those are just going to sit there like that. With that connected, we can connect the throttle position sensor. The throttle position connector is essentially the same length as this wire that has 2 brown wires going to it, which actually reminds me, this is the intake air temperature sensor, which sits up underneath the intake manifold, so we can actually connect both of these. Boom. And then we'll get the throttle position and plug that in. Boom. Pretty. Okay, now we can get on to some fun stuff. So this is the intake boot I'm going to be running. Since I got rid of the traction control module, I needed a new boot to be able to connect up to the MAF sensor. So this is what we're going to be using. It looks like this isn't going to fit how it sits right now because it hits a bracket on the other side of the strut tower. So we're just going to go ahead and trim the boot a little bit.
Ready.
Oh, it does have a blade on it?
I don't know who secured it.
Never mind. We're just taking the bracket off. Boom. Got enough clearance. All right, so there's 2 ports on this elbow to pull vacuum for things. I honestly don't know what the second one is used for, but I know we're gonna have to use 1 for the idle air control valve. The second one though, thankfully this boot came with a plug, so we can just plug up the second one. We can go ahead and throw on the little connector for the idle air control valve. All right, and there you guys can see idle air control valve hooked up. So now we are done with the intake boot. Now we can throw on the MAF after I throw on another hose clamp. All right, so Gabe's going ahead getting the spark plugs and the coil packs in. I got up underneath the car and connected the fuel lines. There's actually one connector right here that I failed to mention. Vanos connects straight over to the fuel rail. And then this plug from the fuel rail is not going to be getting plugged in. Originally, that was for the valve for either the secondary air pump or for the evap system. Either way, those both got deleted, so this connector is just gonna kind of live in here dangling. Alrighty, so if you were wondering why this video took so long to come out, this is why. So I knew that I needed at least a tune that would get rid of the immobilizer system on this, because as you guys know, these cars came with EWS 2, and if you didn't have the right chip in your key that matched up with the immobilizer system, the car just wasn't gonna turn on. So I got the tune from Cassell Performance. This is their Ultimate Swap DME. So as it says on here, it gets EWS delete, muffler flap delete, SAP delete, post-cat O2 deletes, and then along with that, it doesn't say it on here, but this gains an extra 15 horsepower, an extra 10 torque, and then it also bumps the red line up to 7,200 RPM. This was a super affordable option for tuning. I think all said and done, it came out to like just over $300. So I'm super excited to see how this performs. All right, so here's the janky ass setup we got right now. We have the ground wire coming from the battery over to the strut tower. And then we have from the battery cable, we have the 2 power wires going in the bottom. Obviously big loop to big bolt, a small loop to small bolt. And then we have the wires coming from the actual wiring harness. Once again, big loop to big post, and then the 2 small loops to the small post. And then since I don't have my new slave cylinder in yet, I'm just gonna have to go in and press down like the clutch switch, even if there is one. I'm not sure if there is one, but press down the clutch switch and then try to turn the car on. Okay, I think that's everything. Okay, let's put this up on this tripod. All right, so we're gonna hook up the charger real quick, try and get this battery nice and juiced up, and hopefully it should start. All right, I found the clutch safety switch.
I did not expect it to try.
That's what I'm saying, dude. I'm holding back tears, if I'm being honest. That's fucking nuts. This thing just started up like it was nothing. Like it's just...
And we put in the clutch the right way.
We did put in the clutch the right way. I was worried about that. Dude. I want to turn it on again. Ready?
Go.
What? Well, you gotta realize these are painted.
Oh yeah, you're right.
They're painted, yeah.
For real.
So that smoke is fine. That smoke is okay. So it's that easy. I guess if you want to say it's that easy. It's been a process. And it's still gonna be a process. Of course the car, like I said, there's no front end on the car still, so there's still a lot that has to be done. But like, she runs. And she just started up first try. I honestly have no words. I have nothing else that I want to say. Next video, I want to have this car driving. We're gonna take this for a first drive next video. I'm gonna close out the video here, guys. If you're excited for this, and if there's anything specific that you want to see like with this car right now, drop a comment below, drop a like, and subscribe. I don't usually ask for subscribers, but like, this just feels like the right time. It's monumental. I'm so fucking happy. This is such a big step. Still fighting back tears. All right, I hope you all have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.